moral obligation, that intuition,
I didn't understand intuition so much, but rather it was the logical inconsistency is his base for this.
well, yeah, we have an intuitive recognition of the common base of morality, that we should always act out of a sense of duty. Yeah, in that sense, it's intuitive. The contradiction comes in trying to act rationally and do something that is wrong. That's where the contradiction shows up, in the particular moral judgment, right? But I think the difference between them that you may be getting at is this. I use the term intuitive for Kant. Yeah, not in the sense of Moore or Ross, it's not intuitive, but in the sense of a common core of morality. But because of the coming of the positivist verifiability criterion, Anscombe would want to avoid that sort of approach, because the positivist would ask Kant, what is the status? What is the meaning of this sense of duty? You see, is this an empirically accessible sense of duty? And the positivist would say, no, it's not. So Kant's ethic would be ruled out by Ayer's emotivist theory. Do you follow? Now, in sidestepping that, Anscombe is trying to get back to a meaning for the conception of duty or moral law, okay? Therefore making it depend on a moral lawgiver. Carl?
So the recognition of these moral laws is just an outgrowth of a moral lawgiver. It's not intuitive, but more kind of
Yes. So that if a person is a thoroughgoing naturalist and has no moral lawgiver, they're not likely to find any meaning to moral law. Yeah, no factual meaning at all. Now, you see, ask yourself, you can see this quite plainly, ask yourself what sort of meaning in terms of Ayer's verifiability theory, what sort of meaning attaches to a statement like we are all of us morally bound by universal law. You see? Well, to be morally bound, what does that mean? To have subjective feelings of having to do this, subjective feelings of guilt, all right, Ayer would say that's something for the psychologist to describe, has nothing to do with moral obligation, you see. So if you revert simply to psychological descriptions, that doesn't help at all, okay. Remember Ayer's 4 kinds of moral language? Remember? There are psychological descriptions. There are psychological and other subjective descriptions. There are exhortations, okay, which are simply emoting. There are outright emotive utterances. There are purported moral judgments. There are meta-ethical statements, I should say, as well. All right, let's move on to the next. The outcome of that debate over moral language and its meaning reintroduced normative ethics, and we've had the last 20 years of thoroughly vigorous activity in normative ethics. I've listed 5 of the most influential writers. names that you should get familiar with, and you already are if you've been taking ethical theory. John Rawls at Harvard, his book on the theory of justice, introducing a contractarian approach. You recall John Locke's notion of a state of nature, which led, because of common needs and rights, led to a civil society that depended on some sort of social contract. What Rawls is doing is not just talking about a contractarian basis for government, but a contractarian basis for all morality. So he needs to have his equivalent of Rawls' state of nature. And what he describes is what would go on behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. A veil of ignorance. That is to say, if, let's get some space here. That is to say, if a group of people were to adopt a stance that they know nothing about future outcomes which might affect them for better or for worse. Okay, a veil of ignorance. What sort of principles would you then set up for the ordering of our lives behind that veil of ignorance? And he suggests that what would emerge, what he proposes, basis on two principles. One, that the benefits and costs of the society should be equitably distributed. And second, that this should be when there is inequity with advantage to the least advantaged people, with benefit favoring the least advantaged. Well, and on that he tried to propose the way in which a political economy could be ordered in that sort of fashion. It's not quite a utilitarian approach, although when he talks of equalizing benefits and costs, there's obviously a consequentialist note. But it's not a utilitarian approach. He's not simply saying outright, maximize the benefit for the maximum number of people. No. There's a Kantian note in it, the emphasis on equality, ignoring other considerations. There's a Kantian note in it, but it's not a Kantian ethic, acting out of a basic sense of duty. It's a contractarian arrangement. So that morality does not rest on some divine command. It does not rest on some a priori moral principle. It does not rest on empirical assessment of consequences. Okay? Now, in that way, you eliminate divine command, you eliminate natural law, you eliminate Kantian ethics, you eliminate utilitarian ethics. It rests rather on social agreement. It rests rather on social agreement. And his approach has had an immense amount of discussion, not only among ethicists, but in political science, in economics, so forth. In general, his leanings are towards a more liberal than conservative political, economic philosophy on the basis of these principles. Also at Harvard, Robert Nozick, Anarchy, the State and Utopia, is about as conservative in economic and political thought as one could be. Nozick's point is that there is just one basic principle, that every individual has the right to acquire whatever he can, as long as he doesn't take it illegally from somebody else. Acquisition rights is a form of ethical egoism. The one basic moral principle is respect for acquisition rights. Oh, he does advocate a safety net for the least advantaged. But essentially it's a thoroughgoing individualism. It seems to me that he's the philosophical expression of the kind of Reaganomics that talked of individual initiative and essentially of acquisition rights with minimums of legal regulation and safety net. Curiously, those two people in the same department at the same time at Harvard, a few years ago there was one of our graduates in law school there at Harvard, and they were having a discussion about these 2 points of view in one law class, when a voice from the back of the room, which turned out to be Rawls, interrupted and corrected somebody, and another voice turned out to be Nozick from the other side of the room, interrupted likewise, and so they had the two of them in that law class debating this issue. Lots of debates, I suspect. Alan Gaworth, University of Chicago, just retired a couple of years ago, Reason and Morality, essentially a Kantian. And in many ways, he's representative of a rebirth of Kantian approaches to ethics, frequently called respect for persons. Respect for persons is the basic principle. You remember that Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative was that we should always treat people as ends and not just as means. Respect for persons. Well, Alan Gaworth tries to spell that out in terms of the fact that I and each one of us want to have the maximum freedom possible to pursue our own life project. Now, the fact that I want that freedom, if I'm going to be logically consistent rather than logically self-contradictory, means that I should respect other people's freedom to the same end. So we have what he calls a principle of generic consistency. A principle of generic consistency, which is really Kant's universalizability principle. You don't want to assert your own ends, your own goals, your own rights in violation of the same rights in others. That would be violating the principle of generic consistency. And so he has tried to rebuild a Kantian ethic thus. Alan Donegan, who was also at Chicago for many years and then moved to Caltech,